Long before the word marathon meant endurance, it meant shock. For the Greeks, it became a legend, a handful of free citizens standing against the greatest empire the world had yet seen. But for the Persians, it was something different. A curious, irritating, and faintly shameful stumble in a campaign that should have been routine. To understand Marathon, we must leave the Greek storytellers behind and step into the halls of Persepolis, into the mind of King Darius and the commanders who sailed west expecting easy obedience, not heroic resistance. The Persian Empire of the early 5th century BCE was a colossus. From the Indus River to the Aegean Sea, it stretched over 40 satrapies, held by roads, garrisons, tribute, and an administrative system unmatched in efficiency. Darius I had inherited an empire built by Cyrus the Great and expanded it further, organizing its taxes, standardizing coinage, building canals, and commanding armies drawn from dozens of nations: Medes, Persians, Elamites, Egyptians, Babylonians, Scythians. To Darius and his court, the small, quarrelsome cities of mainland Greece were a distant fringe, commercially useful, occasionally troublesome, but no more threatening than a patch of rebellious mountain tribes. What did Persians actually think of the Greeks at the start? Mostly that they were unruly and divided. To the imperial mind, a people unable to submit to one king were backward. Athens and Eretria had annoyed Darius by supporting the Ionian Revolt, a rebellion of Persian subjects in Asia Minor. That revolt had been crushed, Miletus burned, and the empire restored. But Darius wanted a clean message sent across the Aegean. The great king's reach was long, and insolence would be punished. Thus, the expedition of 490 BCE began not as a grand war, but as a punitive raid. Darius sent trusted generals, Darius the Mede and Artaphernes, his nephew, with a force carried by the powerful Persian navy. Their orders: reassert imperial order, punish Athens and Eretria for meddling, and bring the Greek mainland under the same steady submission as Ionia. No one in Persepolis imagined disaster. Greece was small. Its armies were farmer militias. Persia had horsemen, archers, and a fleet that could land troops anywhere. Victory was assumed. Persian soldiers boarding ships at Cilicia or sailing from Phoenician ports likely thought little of their enemy's character. They knew they were part of the king's multi-ethnic army, paid and provisioned by the world's richest empire. They had crushed rebels before. Greece was another restless edge. Some may have remembered the rugged coastlines and merchant ports of Ionia, but Athens itself was a name, not a fear. Confidence came from scale. An empire that spanned continents does not expect to be stopped by a single city. And yet, Persia did respect certain things about the Greeks. Court records and later Persian traditions note their skill in shipbuilding and trade. Greek mercenaries had served in Persian armies before. Cyrus the Younger would famously hire them decades later. But respect was practical, not existential. No Persian courtier believed Greek freedom or hoplite phalanxes posed a system-level threat. When Darius sailed west, his campaign was also political theater. Persian kings projected power as much by spectacle as by slaughter. The sight of the royal fleet, the disciplined landing of troops, the demand for earth and water, tokens of submission, were part intimidation, part ritual. Cities that complied would be treated well. Those that refused would burn. Eretria burned. Naxos fell earlier. Athens, Darius expected, could be cowed. At Marathon, then, the Persians did not come as desperate invaders. They came as masters expecting order. Their army combined archers, light infantry, and the famed Persian cavalry, mobile, skilled, devastating against the slow farmer spearmen of local militias. Their fleet let them strike where they wished. And they camped on the plain of Marathon, not fearing the Athenians, but waiting for them to break. From the Persian point of view, the battle that followed was not supposed to be epic. It was supposed to be one more imperial lesson. The great king's forces had crushed Babylon, Egypt, Scythia. Why should a few thousand Athenians and Plataeans matter? Yet they did. And when word of Marathon finally reached Asia, the story felt less like the Greek legend we know, and more like a frustrating accident. A skirmish gone wrong, a miscalculation by trusted generals, an affront to imperial prestige that would require future correction. This is the story we will trace. Not the familiar Athenian miracle, but the Persian view. How a global empire assessed a small rebellion, how it planned to punish it, what its soldiers experienced when the plan faltered, and how Darius and his court interpreted a defeat they had never expected. To understand that, we need to step back into the Persian world. Its kingship, its army, its sense of order and rebellion, and its first real encounter with the strange, stubborn cities across the Aegean. To understand what the Persians thought about the Greeks at Marathon, we need to step fully into their world. A world where order was vast, wealth unimaginable, and rebellion intolerable. When Darius took the throne in 522 BCE, the Persian Empire was already the largest political structure humanity had seen. Cyrus the Great had forged it by conquering Media, Lydia, and Babylon. Cambyses had added Egypt. Darius inherited this mass and did what an administrator king must do. He organized. He divided the empire into satrapies, provinces ruled by satraps, often relatives or loyal nobles. He regularized tribute, minted the gold daric, built the royal road from Sardis to Susa, and kept garrisons to secure far frontiers. He ruled not just Persians but Elamites, Babylonians, Egyptians, Phoenicians, Medes, Lydians, and countless smaller peoples. In this system, the Aegean was an edge, not a center. The Ionian Greek cities of Asia Minor, Miletus, Ephesus, and others, had long been under Persian control. They prospered under Persian protection, though they sometimes resented tribute and governors. To Persepolis, they were useful subjects, seafaring traders who paid taxes and supplied ships. The Persian idea of kingship was cosmic. The great king was chosen by Ahura Mazda, lord of truth and order. His task was to maintain Asha, the divinely sanctioned order, and crush Druj, chaos and rebellion. When the king punished rebels, he did not see himself as waging a personal feud. He was restoring universal balance. To resist Persia was to defy not only the king, but cosmic right. This view colored every Persian military action. The empire was tolerant in many ways. It let local cultures keep their gods and laws. But it could not tolerate revolt. Order was non-negotiable. A city that rebelled had to be made an example. The Ionian Revolt of 499–494 BCE fit this pattern. Some Greek cities in Asia Minor, aided by Athens and Eretria, rose against Persian rule. For the Persians, this was not a grand war but a nuisance, a local satrap losing control. Still, Darius took it seriously. He crushed the revolt with overwhelming force, burning Miletus as punishment. But one detail lingered. Athens and Eretria had dared send ships and men against the great king. Darius marked them. Greek sources imagine him commanding a servant to remind him each night, "Master, remember the Athenians." Whether true or not, it captures the imperial idea. Insolence, once shown, must be answered. From the Persian viewpoint, Greece looked small and disunited. Dozens of polis, each jealously independent, constantly at war with each other. No single king to negotiate with, no single tribute system. Some, like Thebes, leaned toward Persia when convenient. Others, like Athens and Sparta, could be defiant. For Darius, this was less threatening than annoying. A unified empire prefers stable vassals. The fractious Greeks complicated trade and security in the Aegean. By 490 BCE, Persia's western satrapies were secure. Egypt was quiet. Babylon, long troublesome, was subdued. Darius turned his gaze to the small but noisy rebels across the sea. Punishing Athens and Eretria was not only revenge, it was deterrence. If a tiny polis could burn Sardis, as the Athenians had done during the Ionian Revolt, what would others think? The empire's edge had to be disciplined. The force Darius prepared was impressive, but not enormous by Persian standards. Greek sources inflate numbers into the hundreds of thousands, but modern historians estimate perhaps 20 to 30,000 troops. A balanced expedition of Persian infantry, elite archers, some cavalry, and naval support from Phoenicia, Egypt, and Cyprus. Command went to Datis, a Mede trusted for loyalty. and Artaphernes, Darius's nephew and experienced in Aegean affairs. The plan was swift. Sail the fleet from Cilicia along the Anatolian coast, cross to the Aegean islands, demanding earth and water from each, punish defiance, and land near Athens. As they sailed, the Persians encountered little to change their confidence. Naxos, which had resisted Persian power before, was subdued. Islands like Delos welcomed them, hoping to avoid destruction. Eretria fought but fell. The Persians sacked the city and deported its people, as was standard for rebels. Each step reaffirmed the empire's power. Disobedience met swift retribution. Submission earned mercy. Athens, however, refused submission. To Persians, this was strange but not terrifying. Here was a city of farmers and merchants, powerful among Greeks but tiny beside an empire. It had no cavalry worth fearing, no navy yet tested against Phoenician skill, and no king. Its hoplites, armored citizen spearmen, had a reputation, but Persia had faced heavy infantry before and beaten them with archers and mobility. Darius's commanders likely expected Athens to crumble when faced with imperial might. One factor the Persians did not fully grasp was Greek civic pride. For Athenians, freedom and self-rule were bound up with the city's identity. Submission to a foreign king was unthinkable, even if practical. Persians, accustomed to ruling diverse peoples, often underestimated how deeply some Greeks clung to autonomy. They saw rebellion as local politics. The Greeks saw it as existence itself. Still, the Persian view remained pragmatic. Punish, intimidate, integrate. This formula had worked from Egypt to Bactria. Why should Attica be different? Thus the army landed on the plain of Marathon, a flat space ideal for cavalry and archers within striking distance of Athens, but safe for the fleet to supply. From the Persian perspective, this was careful strategy. Pick a landing where the enemy must fight on your terms. The cavalry could harass, the infantry could advance behind arrow storms, the fleet could outflank if needed. Darius and Artaphernes camped and waited, confident. They knew the Athenians had marched out with their allies from Plataea, but Greek farmers standing behind long spears had faced Persian armies before and lost. No doubt Persian scouts saw the small size of the force, perhaps 10,000 Athenians, and 1,000 Plataeans, and reported that the Greeks were rash to oppose the king's power in the open. The Persians may have thought the city would fracture politically. Many Greek cities did when threatened. What they did not expect was that the Athenians would attack first, and that the terrain would help them. The plain of Marathon was not featureless. Marshy patches and uneven ground complicated cavalry maneuvers. The Athenians, fighting for their homes, used speed and discipline to close with the Persians before arrows could cut them down. Hoplite armor and heavy shields blunted missile fire. Once in close combat, Persian infantry, lighter, less armored, could not easily break the Greek line. Cavalry may have been absent at the key moment, possibly off foraging or redeploying. From the Persian viewpoint, this sudden aggressive charge was shocking. The empire was used to rebels who either hid behind walls or scattered. A disciplined, fast-moving infantry assault against archers and light troops was not the usual pattern. The Greek phalanx, dense, shielded, spears bristling, tore into the Persian center and held. Persian wings may have had some success, but the collapse of the center triggered confusion. Soldiers who had expected an easy route found themselves trapped and pressed into the sea. The fleet saved many, but thousands died. News of this unexpected defeat traveled back across the sea. It was not a catastrophic loss of empire. The fleet remained intact. The army was not annihilated. But it was humiliating. An imperial punishment expedition had been beaten by a city it meant to cow. The great king's name had been stained in a place most Persians considered marginal. For Darius, this was intolerable not because Greece was crucial, but because rebellion had been rewarded with glory. His order had been challenged and, for once, failed. The Persian expedition that reached Marathon in 490 BCE was not conceived as a desperate gamble, but as a well-planned act of imperial discipline. From the deck of the Phoenician and Egyptian ships that carried the army across the Aegean, The campaign looked almost routine. Persia had punished larger rebels before. Its commanders had reason to expect the same outcome in Attica. The fleet moved with confidence. As it sailed from Cilicia and along the coast of Asia Minor, islands and coastal cities were asked to submit in the standard way. Give earth and water, symbols of surrender. Many complied. Some who resisted, like Naxos earlier, were burned or looted. The capture of Eretria, a city that had dared help the Ionian revolt, seemed to confirm Persian invincibility. Its population was deported eastward, scattered into the empire as punishment. These acts were meant to terrify Athens into obedience. They also reinforced the soldiers' sense of inevitability. Everywhere, resistance collapsed. Datis and Artaphernes were experienced commanders. Datis, a Mede, had long served the king loyally. Artaphernes, nephew of Darius, had governed western satrapies and knew the Greek coasts. They understood the need for swift punishment, but also for pragmatic administration. The Persians wanted to frighten Athens, not destroy a useful port city. Imperial policy favored subduing and integrating rather than raising. The choice of Marathon as a landing point reflected this mindset. The wide, flat plain allowed easy disembarkation, open space for archers, and ideal ground for cavalry. It sat close enough to Athens to threaten, but far enough to give the army room to organize. The Persians likely expected the Athenians to hesitate or to negotiate. They might have assumed internal factions would favor surrender. After all, Persian diplomacy often cultivated local elites to avoid hard fighting. But Athens surprised them. Instead of waiting behind walls, the Athenians marched out, roughly 10,000 hoplites, supported by about 1,000 Plataeans. They camped within sight of the Persian lines. This was not how weaker rebels were supposed to act. To Persian eyes, the scene might have looked rash. Farmers in bronze, far fewer than the great king's troops, standing on open ground. The Persians did not rush to attack. They had every reason to be patient. Their cavalry gave them mobility. Their fleet could threaten Athens directly if needed. Supplies came easily by sea. Waiting could bring Greek panic or political collapse. A slow, confident approach was imperial style. Let the enemy stew, then strike when conditions favor you. Yet something in the waiting changed the balance. The Athenians, led by generals like Miltiades, decided not to give the Persians time to maneuver or to unleash their cavalry fully. They planned a sudden assault, a risky move, but one suited to their heavy infantry. When the Greek line advanced at a run across the plain, Persian soldiers likely felt disbelief. Most enemies tried to endure arrow fire, not charge headlong into it. Archers loosed volleys, but the range was short. The hoplites' bronze shields and breastplates absorbed much of the storm. Once the Athenians closed, battle turned from long-range harassment to brutal close combat, exactly where the Persians were less strong. Persian infantry fought with wicker shields, lighter armor, and shorter spears or swords. Against the dense Greek phalanx, overlapping bronze-faced shields and long thrusting spears, they struggled to break formation. The Greek wings, reinforced by Miltiades' plan, enveloped the Persian flanks while the center initially bent back, drawing Persians in before snapping shut. The cavalry, which could have shifted the fight, seems to have been absent or poorly positioned at the critical moment. Some historians suggest they were re-embarking or foraging. For Persian soldiers, the clash was chaos. They were used to enemies breaking under archery and cavalry pressure. Instead, the Greeks pressed forward, shields locked, killing steadily. The Persian center collapsed under the weight. Troops fled toward the sea, many drowning or cut down as they tried to reach the safety of ships. The fleet saved thousands, but the field was littered with Persian dead. Greek tradition claimed 6,400 Persians died to only 192 Athenians, numbers likely exaggerated but showing the shock of the outcome. To the Persians who escaped, the defeat was sudden and humiliating. They had faced stubborn foes before, but never had a small city's citizen militia broken an imperial landing force in open battle. It was not total disaster. The fleet was intact, the army still functional. But it was a jarring interruption of what was meant to be a smooth punishment campaign. Datis and Artaphernes withdrew strategically, sailing south toward Cape Sunion and perhaps attempting a quick strike on undefended Athens. But the Athenians, having marched back from Marathon with astonishing speed, arrived first to defend their city. The Persians, unwilling to risk another unexpected fight, turned back across the Aegean. When news reached Darius, it did not read as a catastrophic war lost. Persia had not poured its full might into Greece. But it was an unacceptable blemish. A punitive raid had failed. Rebels had claimed glory. The great king's aura of invincibility had been nicked. In an empire built on the idea of Asha, order upheld by royal might, such a failure demanded answer. Persian court culture prized stability but understood prestige. Darius could not simply ignore a loss, even a small one. It encouraged defiance elsewhere. Thus plans began almost immediately for a far larger campaign, one that would crush Athens completely and bring the Greek mainland to heel. Inside Persia, Marathon was seen less as an epic than as an irritation, a defeat to be corrected. Greek poets turned it into a miracle of freedom. Persian scribes likely noted it as a failed punitive operation needing follow-up. Still, soldiers and commanders who had been there knew it was not trivial. They had seen a disciplined infantry line break imperial troops and felt the sting of unexpected resistance. And in the long memory of empire, such lessons mattered. Future Persian commanders would respect Greek hoplites more. They would come better prepared for close combat, less confident in cavalry alone. Marathon taught Persia that the strange cities across the Aegean might be harder to cow than expected. When the news of Marathon reached the royal court, it did not arrive as a heroic Greek epic, but as an administrative failure and an insult to imperial prestige. The Persian Empire was too vast for one lost battle to threaten its security. But Darius ruled a system that depended on awe. Subjects from Egypt to Bactria obeyed because the great king's might seemed unstoppable. A public rebellion that escaped punishment, worse, one that humiliated an imperial army, chipped away at that image. Reports would have come through satrapal channels. Datis and Artaphernes had returned with the fleet, but without a decisive victory. Eretria was subdued, yes, but Athens had not been cowed. The army had been beaten in the field and forced to retreat. To Darius, who had crushed Babylon, put down Egypt, and reorganized an empire spanning 3 continents, this was unacceptable. Persian kingship was built on cosmic legitimacy. The king upheld Asha, the divinely sanctioned order. Rebellion was drudge, chaos, and had to be crushed to restore balance. A failed punitive expedition risked signaling weakness. If Athens could strike Sardis, burn a satrapal capital, and then repel an imperial force, what might others think? Darius understood that reputation held the empire together as much as roads and garrisons. The reaction was swift. Prepare a far greater campaign. No longer a quick punitive raid, but a full imperial invasion. Darius began gathering troops and ships from across the empire. This would not be a limited strike by a few satrapies' levies. It would be the whole machine: Persians, Medes, Egyptians, Phoenicians, Cilicians, Indians, Scythians. Supplies were stockpiled. Bridges and canals were planned. Engineers surveyed routes to bring a massive army across the Hellespont into Europe. The goal: crush Athens, intimidate the entire Greek mainland, and reassert Persia's invulnerability. But even kings face limits. Around 486 BCE, Egypt revolted, a far more critical region than Greece. Darius diverted attention to suppress that uprising, but died before he could launch his grand invasion. His son Xerxes inherited both the empire and the unfinished task of avenging Marathon. For Xerxes, the campaign became more than a military expedition. It was dynastic duty. His father had failed to punish Athens, a rare blemish on an otherwise commanding reign. Xerxes had to erase it. Persian chronicles may not obsess over Marathon like Greek writers did, but the sense of unfinished business is clear. The empire did not forget insults. Xerxes prepared methodically. He ordered the construction of pontoon bridges across the Hellespont so his army could march into Europe, an engineering feat to awe subjects and enemies alike. he dug the canal across the Athos Peninsula to avoid the stormy cape that had wrecked an earlier fleet. He assembled perhaps the largest army Persia would ever field, drawing from nearly every satrapy. Greek writers inflated its size into the millions, but even conservative estimates put it at over 100,000, a force dwarfed only by the empire's scale. To Persians, this was not megalomania, but the proper weight of imperial retribution. Athens had resisted, killed imperial soldiers, and celebrated. It had to be crushed thoroughly to restore the aura of the great king. The invasion was meant to show that Marathon was an accident, not a turning tide. Within Persia, this buildup was not just logistics, but propaganda. Reliefs and inscriptions portrayed the king as master of diverse nations. Subject peoples saw tribute flow eastward, soldiers march, ships gather. The empire's reach seemed endless. Xerxes himself embodied royal ideology, calm, divinely chosen, restoring order. He did not need to rant about Marathon. His massive army was the answer. Persian soldiers called up for this campaign likely remembered Marathon in practical terms. A hard fight gone wrong because the Greeks had heavy armor and strange discipline. The new invasion prepared for that. Persia recruited more infantry from subject peoples, including those who could fight in heavier gear. Cavalry remained key, but now it was paired with sheer numbers and better planning for close combat. Archers would still shower enemies, but the army would not underestimate hoplite staying power. Yet, interestingly, Persia's perspective remained imperial rather than personal. Marathon did not spark hatred of Greeks. It was a matter of restoring order. The great king punished rebels. If one punishment failed, another must succeed. It was not a war of civilizations. The Greeks were seen as a troublesome periphery, not an existential rival. This helps explain why Xerxes could still treat Greek submission pragmatically. Before invading, he sent heralds demanding earth and water from many cities. Some complied and were welcomed as allies. The empire preferred willing subjects to endless war. Sparta and Athens, however, refused and prepared for resistance, framing the conflict as freedom versus tyranny. To Persians, this was alien rhetoric. The king ruled many peoples who enjoyed local autonomy. Why should Greeks be different? As Xerxes advanced west, Marathon was a lesson, not a myth. It taught Persia that this corner of the empire required full force and engineering mastery. It reminded commanders not to rely solely on cavalry or expect panic. But it did not alter Persia's sense of itself as dominant. The empire that spanned from India to Egypt could afford setbacks. It could always return stronger. This mindset also explains the Persian reaction after Xerxes' later defeats. Even after Salamis and Plataea, Persia did not collapse. It lost control over the Greek mainland but remained an immense power for another century. Greece was an annoyance, not an existential threat. Marathon was a scratch on imperial pride, not a mortal wound. But at the moment Xerxes marched, the wound still stung. His army was the bandage and the warning. The Persians had underestimated the strange farmers across the sea once. They would not again. And so, the empire that had barely noticed Greece before now gave it unprecedented attention. Marathon forced Persia to look west more seriously, to study Greek warfare, and to commit massive resources to a place it had once thought trivial. A small battle had changed imperial calculus. For the Greeks, Marathon became a myth, freedom preserved, democracy proved. For Persia, it was simpler, an unfinished task, a rebellion inadequately punished, a prestige project that the new king would make right. The Persian Empire survived the Marathon. It survived Salamis, Plataea, and even the slow erosion of its western provinces in the following century. But for an empire so vast, survival was never the issue. Prestige was. How Persia remembered its setbacks mattered more than the defeats themselves. After Xerxes' invasion failed to subdue the Greeks, the Achaemenid world adjusted its gaze. The empire turned inward and eastward again toward the older, wealthier provinces that truly mattered: Mesopotamia, Iran, Egypt, Bactria, and India. The Aegean frontier remained troublesome, but it was never the empire's core. Greece was a rocky edge of the map, poor in tribute compared to Lydia or Egypt, valuable mostly as a corridor for trade. Yet that edge had cost the empire more than expected. It had consumed resources, men, and royal attention, and yielded only embarrassment. Persian records tell us little about these defeats, and that silence is revealing. The empire recorded triumphs, not humiliations. Inscriptions spoke of kings who restored order in the lands of the rebels, never of kings who failed. The great king was by definition victorious. When the Greeks sang of their courage at Marathon, Persia simply moved on, burying the memory under newer projects and distant conquests. The court culture of Persepolis and Susa preferred continuity to introspection. Losing one campaign did not shake their cosmic certainty. For Persian governors in Asia Minor, however, Marathon and the later wars had practical consequences. They still ruled Greek cities along the coast, Ephesus, Miletus, Sardis, and they learned to treat them carefully. Brutal reprisals like the destruction of Miletus after the Ionian Revolt had been effective but costly. Satraps began favoring diplomacy and bribery, understanding that Greeks were fractious and could be divided. The empire realized that it could achieve more through gold and negotiation than through endless fleets. The Persian gold that later flowed into Greek politics, funding exiles, buying loyalty, undermining alliances, was the new weapon born from Marathon's lesson. Inside the empire, Marathon faded into the background of administrative routine. Darius had built too stable a structure for one defeat to matter. Taxes flowed. Royal roads carried messengers. Provinces produced grain, gold, and soldiers. Persian nobles continued to hunt, build palaces, and praise Ahura Mazda. The vast machinery of the empire rolled on. To most Persians, Greece remained a distant curiosity. A small place that had once caused trouble, now contained by diplomacy and the natural limits of ambition. Still, among the officers and scribes who understood the western frontier, Marathon and the Greek wars left traces of caution. The empire had learned that geography mattered. Narrow mountain passes, stormy seas, and rugged coasts favored defenders. It had learned that Greek infantry fought with dangerous discipline, that speed and terrain could offset imperial numbers. And it had learned that victory was not guaranteed by scale alone. Those lessons would quietly shape Persian strategy long after Darius and Xerxes were gone. In the long memory of the empire, the Greeks themselves came to be viewed not as existential enemies, but as a peculiar kind of people, talented, quarrelsome, and brave, but doomed by disunity. Persian administrators could see the irony. The very independence that helped the Greeks resist also made them ungovernable. The empire could afford patience. Greek cities could not. In time, that patience paid off. By the mid-4th century, Persia would reassert influence through diplomacy, supporting whichever Greek faction served its interests. A generation before Alexander, Persian satraps effectively dictated terms to many Greek states. The empire had lost battles but won the long game of endurance. Culturally, Persia did not nurse hatred toward Greece. Its art, inscriptions, and religion stayed focused on universal kingship and divine order, not revenge. The Greek world loomed large in Greek imagination because their freedom story needed Persia as its foil. But in Persian imagination, Greece barely occupied a page. The empire had dozens of rebellious provinces across its span. Greece was simply one of many, remembered briefly, then absorbed into the background hum of governance. Even Xerxes' monumental projects, his bridges, canals, and palaces, outlasted the wars and became symbols of Persian endurance rather than folly. The empire's self-image remained intact. It was still the land of many nations, ruled by one king under heaven, upholding Asha. To dwell on Marathon would have been to admit disorder. So they did not. Silence became its own victory. Yet deep in that silence lay a trace of respect. Persian officers who had faced Greek hoplites could not dismiss them entirely. They had seen a small citizen army hold its ground with terrifying resolve. They had watched men fight not for pay or kingship, but for their own city and families. Persia did not understand such stubborn independence, but it recognized its power. It was perhaps the one thing even an empire could not buy. So what did the Persians really think of the Greeks at Marathon? They thought them strange, reckless, and lucky, but also formidable. They saw them not as equals, but as a people unexpectedly dangerous to underestimate. And they learned to fold that lesson into the patient logic of empire. Conquer what is worth the cost, ignore what is not. In the end, the Marathon did not break Persia. It merely reminded the great king that even the edge of the world can resist when cornered, and that sometimes the smallest rebellion can echo further than 1,000 victories. Stand far from the Aegean, in the dry plateaus of Persia, and Marathon feels small. The great king's palaces at Persepolis still rose after the battle. The empire's roads still ran from Sardis to Susa. Its satraps still ruled Egypt, Babylonia, Bactria. To a Persian courtier, the war with Athens had been a minor frontier operation that went awry. Yet it mattered, not as tragedy, but as a lesson about the empire's limits and the strange defiance of free cities. The Persians never built a single proud memory of Marathon. They left no victory stela to erase defeat, no detailed epic to reframe it. Their archives celebrated triumphs and order restored. Silence covered anything else. To admit failure would crack the image of the king as the bringer of Asha, divine order. Better to move on, reassert strength elsewhere, and let time bury an awkward episode. Marathon disappeared into the great imperial habit of forgetting defeats. But the forgetting itself tells us what Persia truly thought. This was not an existential shock. It was a nuisance. A punishment raid failed. The king would try again. Xerxes did try, assembling a force that dwarfed Datis's fleet and marching with all the grandeur of the empire. When his invasion also faltered, Persia adapted. It abandoned the dream of conquering mainland Greece, yet it did not collapse. It kept its wealth, its roads, its provinces. Greek freedom became a local story. Persian power continued to shape half the known world. At the same time, those few Persians who had fought at Marathon or Salamis could not dismiss the Greeks entirely. They had seen what a citizen militia could do when fighting for its own land. They had felt the bite of heavy bronze and the steadiness of a hoplite line. They understood that the Aegean would never be pacified cheaply. The empire shifted its Western policy because of that understanding. Less brute force, more gold, more diplomacy, more patience. That adjustment was quiet but lasting. This duality, outward silence, inward calculation, shows how empires survive. They do not dwell on defeats, they learn from them. Persia did not mythologize Marathon because it did not need to. It learned, adapted, and continued. Meanwhile, the Greeks, desperate for meaning, turned the same skirmish into legend. Their poets and orators cast it as a defense of freedom and a sign that small communities could defy a superpower. For the Greeks, Marathon became an identity. For Persia, it was a footnote. And yet, in that footnote was a seed. The Persian refusal to give the battle importance could not erase the fact that a vast empire had been checked by a small, self-governing people. Centuries later, when Alexander crossed into Asia, he inherited a Greek memory of defiance and victory that Marathon had helped create. Persia's quiet calculation would be met by a man who believed Greek courage could topple kings. There is something almost philosophical in Persia's response. The empire embodied patience and continuity. Its kings ruled not for a moment, but for ages, measuring success by roads built, gold collected, rebellions suppressed, temples honored. One lost battle did not define it. But that same patience blinded it to the symbolic power Marathon gave its enemies. Ideas outlast armies, and the Greek idea of freedom born on that plain would echo long after Persia's palaces fell. So what did the Persians really think of the Greeks at Marathon? They thought them rebels, annoying, brave, dangerous when cornered. They saw a people divided but fierce, surprising in their discipline. They did not fear Greece as a whole. They did not imagine it would topple the empire. They believed, correctly for a time, that patience and wealth would manage this troublesome fringe. But they also stopped underestimating the West. History, however, remembers battles differently than empires do. Greece's poets told the story until it became a myth: democracy versus tyranny, courage versus vast power. The Persians did not answer with a counter-myth, and so the Greek version won the cultural war. We know Marathon through Athenian eyes because Persia chose silence. Yet that silence was not defeated. It was the pragmatism of a state too large to be defined by one setback. The empire that lost at Marathon went on ruling for another 150 years, influencing law, administration, art, and kingship across Asia. Its roads and tax systems endured long after Athens' glory faded. There is a strange balance here. Greece won a memory. Persia kept an empire. One shaped how the story is told. The other shaped the world while it lasted. Marathon reminds us that what matters in history depends on who tells it, and that small victories can echo louder than great power expects. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson in the Persian view. Defeat need not mean collapse. Prestige can be rebuilt. Power can adapt. An empire may fall silent about its failures, yet quietly integrate the lesson. But silence comes at a cost. It surrenders the story to others. The Persians left the story of Marathon to the Greeks. And so, for 2.5 millennia, we have remembered the plain through the victor's words. A tiny clash made immortal. To hear the other side, we must imagine a court that shrugged, reorganized, and carried on, still vast, still rich, but slightly wiser about the rocky coast across the sea.